University. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. Brad Belstra. Brad is an Indiana native who received both his bachelor's and master's degree from Purdue University. He then went to North Carolina State to pursue his PhD in swine reproductive physiology. He was then hired into a technical service position by IMV Technologies and was based in Minneapolis, Minnesota for 3 years. He then spent 9 years working as technical director of boar stud operations for Smithfield Premium Genetics, which is part of the largest swine production company in the world, Smithfield Foods and the WH Group. Currently, Brad is Reproductive Services Manager for Fast Genetics, and his role is to conduct research to help improve the utilization of reproductive technologies in the swine industry. So this is why I've asked Dr. Belstra to come talk to us today about artificial insemination in the United States swine herds. So welcome, Dr. Belstra.
Good morning, Kara. Thank you.
More than 90% of our swine industry is breeding females using artificial insemination. And the methods to inseminate are continuously evolving. So can you start out by talking to us about how artificial insemination has evolved over the past 20 years?
Sure, Kara. Just, cut me off if I go on a little bit too long, but it's been kind of a slow evolution. So if we go back 20 or 30 years to the 80s maybe, pen and hand mating were what most of the industry was doing. We weren't really doing AI yet. It's not that it didn't exist. It just hadn't quite caught up to the curve and started that. The 90s is really when swine AI started to take off in the United States. And, we started to realize the benefits, but, arguably we kind of eased into it a little bit. I can remember those days, even when the first initial service might be AI, we would follow it up with a natural service with the boar. Because we were worried about performance. We weren't quite sure if AI was going to deliver the same farrowing rate and litter size, so we kind of had to ease our way into it. In the 90s or early 90s was kind of an era of so-called on-farm AI, where you'd have a lab at the sow farm, you would collect boars at the sow farm and do AI right there on site. That kind of involved, as we got better and better at that and gained more trust, that kind of evolved into specialized boar studs that would focus on semen production and semen quality and deliver doses to sow farms, and sow farms would only have boars for heat detection. So that's kind of been the evolution of swine breeding.
So if I'm understanding right, the technologies are really not new, in the past 10, 15 years, but they are just now being adopted as a regular practice.
Yeah, I don't know what the current statistics on our industry is, but it sure feels like over 90%, almost everyone is doing AI. It's become pretty much the standard. I don't think the reasons we adopted are unique to the swine industry. We did it for genetic reasons to decrease genetic lag. It took us a while kind of to get there and realize the economic importance of doing it. But I think we've really embraced it now, and now we're kind of on a pathway to become even more specialized and continue that same quest for spreading one elite boar over more females and reducing more genetic lag and gaining as much as we can from AI.
So is that the terms that we hear now, the PCAI and the deep uterine AI, are those technologies to help us spread these boars over more sows?
That's a good question. That's certainly why people push that direction and develop them. It still kind of remains to be seen how useful they'll be in our quest to continue reducing the number of sperm needed per female inseminated. That's kind of really the name of the game of AI, regardless which species you're talking about. But.
So what is post-cervical AI or PCAI?
Good question. Really, that's kind of a semi-new term that came to us from Europe. Usually pre and post are reserved for talking about relationships in time. What we would have called that originally was intrauterine or transcervical AI, basically just meaning that It's AI, instead of in the cervix, it's actually passing through the cervix and depositing semen in the uterus. So that's not really a new thing, but PCAI is a semi new name.
So aside from having a different location for semen deposition, how does PCAI differ from conventional AI?
That's a good question. There are some key differences that have made it very attractive and kind of increased its popularity. One of the big differences is during the insemination process, the bore isn't present. So normally the conventional AI, what we were doing historically is we would bring the bore out, detect animals in heat and maybe AI them right on the spot while the bore was there and wait for them to take up the insemination dose. With PCAI, we can't really get away from still practicing good heat detection. That's still necessary. But the big difference is the bore's not there. We don't have to move a bore while we inseminate animals. We can go down the row. And the other big difference would be that once we get that catheter inside the cervix, we can deposit the semen very quickly. So, traditionally we'd have to wait for the sow to take up the dose. Now it's just a matter of once we're into the uterine body, just basically squeezing that dose in. So people really like that labor part of PCAI, that it's a little more technical to get the catheter in place, but once it's in place, there's no requirement of moving the bore, and we can put the semen in very rapidly and move on down the line. So it's really the speed of the process that really gets people on farm excited about this change.
So can you give me an idea of the time difference? So how long does it take to breed conventionally versus how long does it take post-cervically?
Yeah, just off the top of my head, it varies sow to sow, but conventionally, it might take 3 to 7 minutes for an individual sow to take up that insemination dose. Whereas with PCAI, once we have that catheter in place, which really doesn't take very long, we can essentially just empty the dose within just a few seconds. So
that does seem
that's
like
probably
a big savings in time.
Yeah, and that's the convenience part of it. I think is what has really brought PCAI back. We kind of had a period around 2000 or so where people were experimenting with it. It was a little more technical. They didn't get better fairing rate and litter size. They kind of used the same dose, got the same results, or maybe slightly worse results because of the learning curve, and then they abandoned it. Now it's come back here more recently, and I think for a little bit different reasons. Still, for one of the reasons is reducing the dose to get more out of the genetic program, but the one that seems to really be making it stick is the speed and the labor savings that people like, and maybe even specialization of labor on sow farms. So the ability of the best people in the breeding barn to do all the AIs themselves and freeing up labor to specialize on other things like farrowing management. It just reduces labor to some degree, at least in terms of the labor it takes to do the actual insemination.
So just make sure I get it, the technology of post-cervical AI, even though it's been adopted probably a lot more in the past 5 years, it also is not really a new technology.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
It's kind of been developed 10 or 15 years ago, maybe gained popularity in Europe, but it wasn't really adopted in the US, at least on the first time around, and there's several reasons for that.
Okay. So with PCAI, would a producer expect to see an improvement in conception rate or similar, or how does that work?
That's a good question. At the same size dose or the same number of sperm per dose, there's a little bit of evidence of maybe a little better conception rate or fairing rate with post-cervical. The jury's still out on that a little bit, but some people argue that the reason that may exist is with PCAI, you have to transverse the cervix. So when you compare it to conventional AI, you may not be comparing exactly the same types of sows, because with PCAI, you run into a few animals that if you're not doing a good job heat detecting, or you'll run into animals that you just can't get through the cervix. And then it's a question of, do I wait and come back and do it later? Do I skip this animal? Do I give her a conventional AI? So that may explain why when we compare the two techniques, you could see slightly different conception rate and fairing rates at the same dose. Probably the other part of it is just the learning curve of getting comfortable with a new technique. I know during the initial introduction of this technology, some people actually saw worse results, and part of that may have been they stopped detecting heat, stopped doing a good job focusing on that, or maybe they just had struggles and difficulties with the catheter and getting it passed through the cervix. And it's a little more technical process in some ways. So
I imagine also the catheters have probably evolved a lot over the years as well.
that's an excellent point. Kind of the first time this technology was introduced, the catheters were the inner catheter that transverses the cervix was harder, less flexible. If you got too heavy handed with it, there could be the potential for injuring the sow. Definitely the ones that have come around more recently are softer and more flexible, much more user friendly, and probably gentler on the sow as well.
So you've talked several times about the dose and then the number of sperm cells in the insemination dose. Are those different between conventional and post-cervical AI?
They certainly can be. Sometimes when people start this technology or get comfortable with the process of PCAI, they just use the same old dose. And there's certainly no detriment to doing that. It just doesn't capture the advantage of, the recorded advantage of reducing the dose is kind of why interuterine was pushed and came around. Was that idea of taking a standard conventional AI dose and kind of cutting the volume and cutting also the total number of sperm in half was kind of the rule of thumb and what was popular in Europe. And there's some evidence that getting to the cervix does, reduce the number of sperm that are lost, reduces backflow after the insemination or during the insemination process. And there's some evidence that it may help produce the same results with slightly lower numbers of sperm.
So I've heard several people lately use the term bulk semen. Can you explain what that is?
That is becoming more popular in our industry as of late. Again, that's something that's not really a new concept, but basically it just is a shortcut to making individual doses. So the semen's extended fully, whether it's a single sire collection or whether it's a number of boars that are put in a pool, and they're just put in a specialized bag basically, and sent to the farm without being divided into individual doses, with the idea being that process happens as you go through the barn down the insemination row. So the bag is connected by a piece of tubing to a syringe-like gun, and you administer the doses not that differently from the way some of our vaccinating guns would work that can be connected by a tubing to a bottle of vaccine.
And so this technology would really be used only with post-cervical AI where we can deliver the semen quickly, correct?
That's right. That's the technology it would work best with because it's kind of a squirt, rapidly dispense the semen and move on down the line. It's not conducive to a slow uptake of the semen like we had with conventional AI.
So now let's switch gears a little bit to this deep uterine AI. How is that different than from PCAI?
Good question. Initially, intrauterine or PCI was kind of referred to as deep because it was through the cervix and into the uterus. Now we have the term deep intrauterine AI, meaning not in the body of the uterus as PCAI is, but further up the uterine horn. How far is debatable, but somewhere past the uterine body. Sows have a very long uterine horns, very tortuous, very winding. That's what helps them produce large litters. And deep intrauterine AI just means that the catheter is snaked up that uterine horn as far
Are
as
there any
possible, usually.
are there any commercial producers that you know of that are using the deep uterine AI?
Not that I can think of. There's certainly been some experimental work in Europe and here in the United States with this technology, but it's really kind of in the experimental phase. There's not a lot of commercial people, I don't think, although there are some catheters commercially available from a couple companies that are designed for deep AI.
So, what do you think the challenges are with the industry adopting the deep uterine AI, or what are the potential benefits that could come from using that technology?
When I look at some of the reasons that PCAI didn't get adopted the first time, or some of the reasons that it seems to have stuck and become really popular this time, I think those will tell us a lot about as we try to go to a site farther up the uterus, what's going to have to happen. There has to be an economic advantage, and it has to be able to help us reduce the dose. One of the things that got PCAI implemented is it seemed to speed up the insemination process. So if deep AI is much more technical or slows down the insemination process greatly, that may work against its adoption. So some of those obstacles, there has to be value to it. And the other thing is that if it's increases labor instead of reduces it, it'll be harder to make that commercially popular.
So, Dr. Belstra, as one of our nation's reproductive specialists in swine, what does your crystal ball tell you are some of the technologies that might be adopted in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, the evolution of swine AI has been kind of slow. As an industry, we're kind of hesitant until we're certain that something's going to work. But I think there are signs, at least here lately, that the progress of that evolution is kind of speeding up. Probably one of the first things that we're already seeing in commercial production a little more is the use of synchronization. There's some products available for synchronizing the estrus and ovulation of wean sows to go from administering 2 AIs, which is kind of the norm, one every 24 hours, to being able to do one fixed time AI. So that's another method of reducing the sperm required per female. And that seems to be gaining popularity slowly. So that's encouraging sign that our industry is conscious of reducing semen needs and maximizing the usage of elite boars for genetic gain. So synchronization is definitely one tool that feels like it'll probably stick around and have a value. Probably the second thing is, as you mentioned, we keep seeing sided deposition in the uterus used as a tool potentially to further reduce the dose. And we're still working on that experimentally. We've got some products available, but they're going to have to prove their worth for that to be adopted, I think, at a commercial level. So we're still working on that one. But the third thing I would name kind of in the evolution of what should happen is that we need a better understanding of boar fertility. We realize that it's very apparent that some sires can tolerate a bigger reduction in sperm dose and maintain the same level of fertility, whereas others can't. So if we have better tools to identify the genetic markers of this low dose fertility in boars, we could select for animals of higher fertility, and that would greatly help us reduce the dose. But that's kind of the trend that we see, in today's AI industry.
Well, Dr. Belstra, I really thank you for joining us today and providing your expertise on AI and the changes we've seen and what we might see coming here in the future. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of Swine Scoop.